In medieval Aquitaine, the most valuable thing people depended on did not come from vineyards, gold chests, or royal storehouses. It came from walnut trees. Slowly pressed from crushed nuts, walnut oil became one of the most important substances in everyday life. It was pale in color, smelled warm and nutty, and could be used in ways that most people today would never imagine. For farmers, monks, and traders, walnut oil was not just food. It was light, medicine, protection, and income all rolled into one. The land itself made this possible. Aquitaine had the kind of climate walnut trees loved. Winters were mild rather than brutal, rain was frequent, and fog often sat low in the valleys. The hills rolled gently instead of dropping sharply, which helped trees take root without washing away. Families planted walnut trees along paths, field edges, and sloped land that was hard to use for crops. These trees took years to mature, but once they did, they produced for generations. A single grove could support children, grandchildren, and beyond. Unlike grain, which depended heavily on good weather every year, walnut trees were dependable. Too much rain ruined wheat and barley, but walnuts still grew. Late frost damaged crops, but the trees survived. Even when soil grew tired and thin, walnut roots pushed deep and found what they needed. Because of this, walnuts became one of the safest crops a family could rely on. Over time, wealth was measured less by livestock and more by how many healthy walnut trees a household owned. Animal fat was hard to come by for most medieval people. Livestock had to be kept alive through winter, not eaten. Butter spoiled quickly, especially in Aquitaine's damp climate. Lard was rare and expensive. Walnut oil filled that gap. It provided fat, calories, and flavor without needing animals at all. Families gathered fallen nuts, dried them, and pressed them into oil that could last months without turning bad. This oil made simple meals better. A bowl of boiled grains or vegetables tasted richer with a splash of walnut oil. Fish from nearby rivers became more filling. Even plain porridge felt nourishing. And because walnut oil stayed fresh longer than animal fats, it could be stored safely through long, wet winters. In homes where butter might spoil in days, walnut oil stayed usable week after week. What made it even more important was that it did not require land for grazing or constant care. Poor families could collect nuts just as well as rich ones. You didn't need cows or sheep, just time, patience, and access to trees. For many households, a clay jug of walnut oil meant the difference between barely surviving and eating well enough to stay strong. Light mattered just as much as food. Nights were long, especially as the climate cooled during the early Little Ice Age. Darkness was dangerous. Homes were made of wood and earth, and smoke-filled air could make people sick. Walnut oil burned cleanly. It produced a steady flame with very little smoke. This made it safer than animal fat candles and far more comfortable to use indoors. Monasteries depended on it heavily. Monks working in scriptoria spent hours copying text by hand. Smoke or flickering light could ruin pages or strain eyes. Walnut oil lamps gave a bright, stable glow that did not stain parchment. Because of this, it became one of the preferred fuels for religious study and writing. Village homes used it the same way. Kitchens, workshops, and evening gatherings relied on walnut oil lamps to extend the day. Some families even kept a separate container of oil just for lighting, protected and saved carefully. In a world where darkness dominated much of the year, walnut oil held back the night. Its value went beyond households. Walnut oil became a serious source of income. Because walnut groves took decades to mature, they were treated like long-term investments. Lords taxed not only the land where trees grew, but also the pressing of the nuts and the sale of the oil. Communal presses were often owned or controlled by feudal authorities, who took a share of the oil as payment. Even when grain harvests failed, walnut oil production continued. That made it extremely attractive to those in power. Markets in regions like Périgord and Dordogne became known for walnut oil trade. Merchants valued it because it was light, durable, and expensive enough to justify long transport. A small shipment could be worth more than bulk grain. This steady income helped fund churches, fortifications, and local administration. Walnut oil quietly supported the financial backbone of the region. It linked peasant labor to noble wealth without drawing much attention to itself. In the kitchen, walnut oil shaped how people cooked and stored food. Its nutty flavor improved everyday meals made from grains, roots, and fish. Mixed with vinegar, it created an early version of salad dressing that added freshness to limited diets. Beyond taste, it helped preserve food. A thin layer poured over stored grains or legumes protected them from moisture and mold. Cheese too benefited. Oil created a barrier that slowed spoilage. During wet winters, this protection mattered. Without it, families risked losing much of their stored food. Bakers sometimes used walnut oil in special breads made for feast days. These loaves were softer and more fragrant than everyday bread, turning simple ingredients into something worth celebrating. Walnut oil also had a place in healing. People believed it carried warmth and balance. Mixed with herbs, it became the base for salves used on aching joints, sore skin, and swelling. During cold months, warmed oil was rubbed onto hands, chest, or temples to chase away illness. Cracked skin from labor and wind was soothed with it. Midwives used walnut oil to soften skin and ease discomfort. Older villagers relied on it for stiff joints and long-term pain. Even without modern knowledge, people trusted what experience showed them. Walnut oil helped gently and reliably. Artists and craftsmen depended on it too. Painters used walnut oil to bind pigments. It dried evenly and stayed clear longer than animal-based mixtures. Colors appeared smoother and more luminous. For religious images meant to last generations, this mattered deeply. Woodworkers rubbed it into furniture and tools to protect them from Aquitaine's constant moisture. Leatherworkers softened hides with it. Metal workers sometimes coated tools to slow rust. Because walnut trees were everywhere, artisans could rely on a steady supply. Wood preservation was especially important. Barns, carts, plows, and beams were treated with walnut oil to keep them from rotting. The oil soaked into the wood, repelling water and reducing cracks. For families with limited resources, making tools last longer meant survival. Fishermen and river traders even used walnut oil on smaller wooden fittings. It wasn't as strong as tar, but it was clean, accessible, and useful for everyday care. In all these ways, walnut oil quietly protected the physical foundations of medieval life. As walnut oil production grew, Aquitaine slowly became one of the most important suppliers in medieval Europe. One reason was how easy the oil was to transport compared to grain or livestock. Roads were rough, carts broke easily, and river travel controlled most trade routes. Walnut oil solved many of these problems. It was light for its value and stayed usable for long periods. Merchants filled ceramic jars, wooden flasks, or small barrels and sent them along rivers like the Dordogne and Garonne toward Bordeaux. From there, the oil moved outward to England, Flanders, and parts of Iberia. These regions wanted reliable cooking oil and clean burning lamp fuel, and Aquitaine had both in one product. Over time, Aquitaine walnut oil developed a reputation. Buyers trusted its quality and consistency. That trust allowed merchants to charge better prices, which encouraged more villages to plant trees and invest in presses. Entire local economies grew around walnut oil production. Pride developed in how carefully oil was pressed and how distinct its flavor was from one valley to another. This trade strengthened regional identity. People began to see walnut oil not just as something useful, but as something that represented where they came from. It tied rural villages to distant cities and foreign markets. Through this simple product, Aquitaine became connected to a much larger economic world. Walnut oil's importance reached into religion as well. Churches relied on it for lamps during services and night prayers. Its clean flame suited sacred spaces where smoke was unwelcome. In some monasteries, careful records were kept of oil stores, showing how critical it was to religious life. Daily rhythms adjusted around it. Meals, work, prayer, and rest all depended on the availability of light and food, both supported by walnut oil. Even social gatherings in the evening relied on lamps fueled by it. Without oil, life shrank to daylight hours only. Because walnut trees took years to mature, they also shaped how people thought about time and inheritance. Planting a walnut tree meant planning for children who might not yet be born. Cutting one down was a serious decision, often avoided unless absolutely necessary. Trees were passed down like property, mentioned in agreements and disputes. The trees themselves shaped the land. Their roots stabilized hillsides and reduced erosion. They created shaded paths and boundaries between fields. Over decades, walnut groves became part of the landscape, as familiar as churches or rivers. Despite its importance, walnut oil was never flashy. It didn't carry the prestige of wine or the excitement of spices. It worked quietly in the background. That may be why it is often overlooked today. But for medieval Aquitaine, it touched nearly every part of life. It fed families when meat was scarce. It lit homes when darkness was long. It healed skin, preserved tools, protected wood, supported artists, and filled merchant carts. It gave lords steady taxes and peasants reliable nourishment. When grain failed, walnut oil endured. When weather turned cruel, trees still produced. In a world ruled by uncertainty, that consistency mattered more than luxury. Even today, traces of this history remain in old groves, traditional presses, and regional recipes. Though modern attention has shifted elsewhere, walnut oil once shaped how people lived, worked, traded, and survived. It was never loud. It never demanded attention. But without it, medieval Aquitaine would have been a very different place.